A millionaire duke discovers his humble maid, shielding his disabled daughter from unspeakable cruelty. And what unfolds next will leave you speechless. What if I told you that in 1825, within the marble halls of one of America's grandest estates, the most powerful man in 3 states would be brought to his knees by a servant's simple act of courage? This is not just another story about wealth and privilege. This is about a moment that shattered everything a father thought he knew about love, duty, and what it truly means to protect the ones we cherish most. But before we continue, please check if you are already subscribed to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching this video from. Eleanor Hartwell had scrubbed the floors of Ravenshollow Manor for 18 long years. Her calloused hands, bearing witness to countless dawns, spent polishing marble that would gleam like mirrors for the Duke's distinguished guests. At 42, she moved through the grand corridors with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to become invisible, her worn black dress and white apron the uniform of her station. She had arrived at the estate as a young woman of 24, desperate for work after her husband's death in a textile mill accident, carrying nothing but determination and a fierce work ethic that would earn her the grudging respect of even the harshest overseers. The Duke of Ravenshollow, Charles Pemberton III, was a man whose very presence commanded attention in drawing rooms from Boston to Charleston. His wealth stemmed from vast shipping enterprises and cotton plantations that stretched across 3 states, making him one of the richest men in America. At 38, he cut an imposing figure with his perfectly tailored coats, silver-tipped walking stick, and eyes that could freeze a man's blood when business required it. Politicians sought his favor, socialites vied for his attention, and business rivals feared his calculated ruthlessness in matters of commerce. But today, as autumn rain pelted the tall windows of the manor's east wing, Eleanor's world was about to collide with her master's in ways neither could have imagined. She was making her way through the library, dusting the leather-bound volumes that lined the walls from floor to ceiling, when she heard something that made her blood run cold. The sound was unmistakable, even through the thick oak doors that separated the library from the morning room. It was the cruel laughter of young men, accompanied by a child's muffled sobs. Eleanor's heart began to race as memories flooded back of her own childhood, of playground torments and whispered cruelties that had followed her for being the miller's daughter, with patched dresses and worn shoes. She knew that particular brand of laughter, the kind that fed on another's pain and grew stronger with each tear it caused. Her hands trembled as she set down her dusting cloth and moved toward the door, every instinct telling her to investigate, despite the strict household rules about servants remaining invisible during the Duke's private family time. Through the slightly ajar door, Eleanor could see into the morning room where a scene of heartbreaking cruelty was unfolding. Little Lady Victoria Pemberton, the Duke's 8-year-old daughter, sat hunched in a chair by the window, her small body shaking with silent tears. The child had been born with what the doctors called mental deficiency, though Eleanor had observed her closely enough over the years to know that Victoria was far brighter than anyone gave her credit for. She simply saw the world differently, needed more time to process words and emotions, and had developed her own unique way of expressing the depth of feeling that lived within her gentle soul. Standing around Victoria were 3 young men, sons of prominent families, who had come to call on the Duke for business purposes. They appeared to be around 16 to 18 years old, dressed in fine riding clothes and wearing expressions of aristocratic amusement. The ringleader, a tall youth with sandy hair and cruel blue eyes, was making exaggerated facial expressions, mocking the way Victoria sometimes moved her hands when she was trying to communicate something important. His companions snickered and whispered comments about the simpleton Duchess, and how embarrassing it must be for such a distinguished family to have such a burden. Eleanor watched Victoria's face crumble further with each cruel word, and something inside the maid snapped. She had watched this precious child grow from a toddler into a sweet, sensitive little girl who loved flowers, spent hours creating intricate drawings, and showed more genuine kindness than most adults Eleanor had encountered. Victoria might process the world differently, but her capacity for love and her artistic talents were extraordinary. To see her tormented by these privileged bullies while her father remained absent, likely buried in his study conducting business, made Eleanor's protective instincts flare with white-hot intensity. The Duke, meanwhile, was indeed in his private study 3 rooms away. completely absorbed in reviewing shipping manifests and correspondence from his cotton factors in Charleston. He had developed the habit of scheduling his business affairs during Victoria's morning lessons, assuming his daughter was safely occupied with her governess, Miss Abernathy. What he did not know was that Miss Abernathy had taken ill that morning and retired to her quarters, leaving Victoria to wander into the morning room where she had encountered the visiting young men who were waiting for their fathers to conclude business with the Duke. Eleanor could see Victoria trying to make herself smaller, pressing back into the chair as if she could disappear entirely. The sight of such vulnerability being exploited by those who should have known better triggered something primal in Eleanor's protective nature. She had spent 18 years perfecting the art of invisibility, of never speaking unless spoken to, of keeping her opinions and emotions carefully locked away. But watching Victoria's silent suffering, Eleanor realized there were some things more important than job security or social position. Without another moment's hesitation, Eleanor pushed open the door and strode into the morning room with a purposefulness that immediately commanded attention. Her worn shoes made no sound on the Persian carpet, but her presence filled the space with such quiet authority that the three young men stopped their cruel pantomime mid-gesture. Eleanor had learned over the years that true power did not always announce itself with volume or bluster. Sometimes it spoke in measured tones and unwavering eye contact. "Gentlemen," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the steady strength of someone who had faced genuine hardship and survived, "I believe you have lost your way to the drawing room, where your fathers are conducting business with His Grace." Her tone was respectful but firm, neither servile nor aggressive, walking the careful line that domestic staff had to master when addressing their social superiors who were behaving badly. The sandy-haired ringleader looked her up and down with the dismissive arrogance that came naturally to those born into privilege. "We were not addressing you, servant," he replied with a sneer. "Perhaps you should return to whatever menial task requires your attention and leave your betters to their conversation." His companions chuckled at what they considered a clever put-down, their sense of superiority intact despite being caught in an act of cruelty. Eleanor had encountered this type of arrogance countless times over the years, from visiting dignitaries to merchant princes who believed their wealth entitled them to treat staff as less than human. But she had also learned that beneath such bluster often lay insecurity and uncertainty, especially in young men who were still finding their place in the world. She stepped closer, positioning herself between the bullies and Victoria, her posture protective but non-threatening. "I have been in service to this household for 18 years, Eleanor said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of experience and unwavering certainty. "I have watched Lady Victoria grow from a baby into a remarkable young woman with talents and sensitivities that most people never develop. What I observe here today is not conversation among gentlemen, but cruelty directed at a child who has done nothing to deserve your mockery." Her words were chosen carefully, acknowledging their social status, while making it clear that their behavior fell short of the standards expected from true gentlemen. Victoria looked up at Eleanor with eyes wide with amazement and gratitude. No adult had ever stepped forward to defend her before, and the child's expression showed a mixture of hope and disbelief that someone had finally seen her pain and chosen to act. Eleanor felt her heart clench as she recognized the depth of loneliness in those young eyes, the resigned acceptance of cruelty that no child should ever have to develop. The sandy-haired youth's face flushed red with indignation at being challenged by someone he considered beneath his notice. His aristocratic upbringing had taught him that servants existed to facilitate his comfort and defer to his wishes, not to question his behavior or defend their charges against his amusement. The very idea that this common maid would dare lecture him about proper conduct struck him as an intolerable breach of natural order. "For how dare you speak to me in such a manner?" he snarled, taking a step closer to Eleanor with what he clearly intended as an intimidating posture. "Do you have any idea who my father is? Who I am? One word from me, and you will be dismissed from this position without references, left to beg in the streets where creatures like you belong." His voice rose with each word, the entitled rage of someone who had never been told no by anyone he considered his social inferior. Eleanor stood her ground without flinching, though she was acutely aware that this young man's threat was not empty. His father was indeed a powerful textile manufacturer whose business dealings with the Duke were worth thousands of dollars annually. A complaint from such a family could easily result in her immediate dismissal, and at 42, with no other skills, finding new employment would be nearly impossible. But as she glanced at Victoria, who was watching this confrontation with wide, frightened eyes, Eleanor realized that some principles were worth any personal cost. "I understand perfectly who you are, sir," Eleanor replied with calm dignity. "You are young men of privilege who have been blessed with advantages that most people can only dream of. Fine educations, comfortable homes, families who love and support you. Which makes your choice to use those blessings to torment a vulnerable child all the more disappointing." Her words carried no anger or accusation, only a profound sadness that made her point more effectively than any harsh rebuke could have. The two companions shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing something in Eleanor's tone that reminded them of their own mothers or governesses who had tried to instill basic decency in their characters. But their leader was too deeply invested in his outrage to back down now. He raised his hand as if to strike Eleanor, his face twisted with the kind of rage that came from having his self-image challenged by someone he had dismissed as unworthy of consideration. At that precise moment, the morning room door opened fully and Duke Charles Pemberton III stepped into the room. His imposing figure filled the doorway, and his steel-grey eyes immediately took in the tableau before him. His daughter cowering in her chair, a servant standing protectively between her and three young visitors, one of whom had his hand raised in a threatening gesture toward his household staff. The Duke's presence transformed the atmosphere of the room instantly, like the sudden appearance of a thundercloud that changes the very quality of light and air. Charles Pemberton had not built one of America's largest fortunes by being a passive observer, and his ability to read a situation quickly and accurately had served him well in countless business negotiations. What he saw in his morning room made his jaw tighten with barely controlled fury, though his expression remained carefully neutral as he assessed the dynamics at play. "Gentlemen," the Duke said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made generals pause and senators reconsider their positions, "I was not aware that your morning entertainment included terrorizing my daughter and threatening my household staff." Each word was pronounced with crystalline clarity, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the three young men realized they had been caught in a situation that would require very careful handling. The sandy-haired ringleader immediately lowered his raised hand and attempted to salvage the situation with the kind of smooth talking that had gotten him out of trouble at boarding school. "Your Grace," he began, with what he clearly hoped was a winning smile, "there has been a misunderstanding. We were merely engaging in conversation with Lady Victoria when this servant inserted herself inappropriately into our discourse. I was simply attempting to remind her of her proper place in the household hierarchy." Duke Pemberton's eyes narrowed dangerously, and Eleanor recognized the expression she had seen on his face when business rivals attempted to deceive him, or when politicians tried to manipulate him for their own gain. The Duke had not achieved his position by accepting convenient explanations or allowing others to control the narrative when his own interests were at stake. He stepped further into the room, his silver-tipped walking stick tapping against the floor with each measured step. "I see," the Duke replied, his tone deceptively mild. "And this conversation with my daughter, was it the sort that typically reduces 8-year-old children to tears? Was it the kind of discourse that requires an adult to position herself protectively between participants?" His questions hung in the air like accusations, and the three young men began to realize that their comfortable assumptions about their social immunity might be about to face a serious challenge. Eleanor remained exactly where she was, neither advancing nor retreating, but her heart was pounding with the realization that everything she had worked for over the past 18 years hung in the balance. The Duke was indeed wealthy and powerful enough to destroy these young men socially and financially if he chose, but he was also a pragmatic businessman who understood the importance of maintaining relationships with other prominent families. She had no way of knowing whether he would sacrifice one servant to preserve valuable business connections. Victoria, meanwhile, had stopped crying and was watching this adult confrontation with the intense focus of a child trying to understand which way the wind was blowing and whether she would be safe or sorry when the storm passed. Duke Pemberton walked slowly around the room, his calculating gaze moving from each young man to Eleanor to his daughter, gathering information the way he might assess the assets and liabilities of a potential business acquisition. He had learned long ago that the most valuable insights often came from observing people when they thought they were unobserved, and the scene he had walked into told him more about the true character of everyone involved than hours of polite conversation ever could. "Lady Victoria," the Duke said, turning to address his daughter with the formal courtesy he might show to any lady of his acquaintance, "would you be so kind as to tell me about the conversation you were having with our young visitors?" His tone was gentle but serious, conveying that her answer mattered and would be treated with the respect due to any person reporting on events they had witnessed or experienced firsthand. Victoria looked uncertainly between her father and the three young men, clearly torn between her desire to tell the truth and her fear of potential consequences. Eleanor could see the internal struggle playing out on the child's expressive face, the way she bit her lower lip and twisted her hands in her lap, while trying to decide whether it was safe to speak honestly about what had happened to her. "They were making faces at me, Papa," Victoria said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "They said I looked funny and talked strange, and they laughed when I tried to tell them about my drawings. They said you must be embarrassed to have a daughter like me, and that normal families do not have children who are broken like I am." The words came out in a rush, as if she was afraid her courage would fail if she did not speak quickly. The silence that followed Victoria's testimony was profound and dangerous. Duke Pemberton's face went through a series of subtle changes, from surprise to understanding, to a cold fury that was all the more intimidating for being completely controlled. Eleanor had seen him angry before, when business deals fell through or when staff failed to meet his exacting standards, but she had never seen him look quite like this. It was the expression of a man who had just discovered that someone had attacked what he valued most in the world. "I see," the Duke said again, but this time his voice carried undertones that made even Eleanor shiver, despite her position of relative safety in this confrontation. "So, you entertained yourselves by convincing my daughter that she is defective, that her father views her as an embarrassment, that she is somehow broken beyond repair. How remarkably creative of you to devise such sophisticated entertainment for a Tuesday morning." The three young men were beginning to understand that their situation was far more precarious than they had initially realized. The Duke's reputation for ruthlessness in business was well known, and his ability to hold grudges and settle scores was legendary among those who moved in his social circles. Duke Pemberton walked to his daughter's chair and knelt beside her, something Eleanor had never seen him do before in all her years of service. The gesture was shocking in its tenderness, and completely at odds with his usual formal relationship with Victoria. He took her small hands in his much larger ones, and when he spoke, his voice carried a gentleness that few people had ever heard from the formidable Duke. "Victoria, my dear child," he said, looking directly into her eyes, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. You are not broken. You are not an embarrassment. You are my daughter, and that makes you precious beyond measure. Anyone who suggests otherwise is speaking from ignorance and cruelty, not from truth." His words were spoken with such conviction that even Eleanor felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Victoria's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they seemed to be tears of relief rather than pain. "Really, Papa, you do not wish I was different?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of years of uncertainty and self-doubt that no child should have to bear alone. "I would not change a single thing about you," the Duke replied firmly. "Your mind works differently than some people's, but that gives you gifts that others do not possess. Your drawings show beauty that most adults cannot see, and your heart holds more kindness than most people develop in an entire lifetime." He squeezed her hands gently. "These young men spoke from meanness, not from truth, and they will not have the opportunity to speak to you again." The transformation in Victoria's expression was immediate and profound. The hunched defensive posture melted away, replaced by the straight-backed bearing of a child who had just been reminded of her own worth. Eleanor felt tears of her own threatening to fall as she watched this powerful man choose to show vulnerability and tenderness in front of people who might use it against him in business or social situations. The Duke stood and turned back to the three young visitors, and the gentleness that had characterized his conversation with Victoria evaporated instantly, replaced by the cold fury of a man who had been pushed beyond the limits of his considerable patience. "As for you, gentlemen," he said, his voice dropping to a tone that Eleanor had heard him use when dismissing employees who had betrayed his trust, "you have demonstrated a fundamental lack of character that makes you unsuitable company for anyone in my household." The sandy-haired ringleader made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation, perhaps recognizing that his family's business relationship with the Duke hung in the balance. "Your Grace, surely you understand that we meant no real harm. We were simply engaging in the kind of high-spirited jest that young men have always enjoyed. Perhaps we were a bit thoughtless, but certainly nothing that requires such serious consequences." The Duke's smile was thin and entirely without warmth, the expression of a predator who had cornered his prey and was savoring the moment before delivering the killing blow. "High-spirited jest," he repeated, his voice carrying just enough mockery to make the phrase sound ridiculous. "Is that what we are calling the systematic emotional torture of disabled children these days? How remarkably progressive of your generation to devise such creative terminology for ancient cruelties." Eleanor watched as the Duke moved closer to the three young men, his imposing height and breadth making them seem smaller and more insignificant with each step. She had seen him negotiate with senators and intimidate business rivals, but she had never witnessed him channel his considerable power toward protecting someone vulnerable rather than advancing his own interests. The sight was both thrilling and slightly terrifying in its implications. "I know each of your fathers personally," the Duke continued, his tone conversational but laden with threat. "We have conducted business together for years, and I have always respected them as honorable men who raise their sons to understand the difference between strength and cruelty. I find myself wondering how disappointed they would be to learn that their sons have chosen to use their privileges to torment children rather than to lift up those who need protection." The three young men exchanged worried glances, finally beginning to understand that their comfortable assumptions about social immunity were about to cost them dearly. The Duke's business connections extended throughout the eastern seaboard, and his opinion carried weight in social circles that could make or break young men's prospects for advantageous marriages, business opportunities, and political advancement. A word from him could close doors that might never open again. "Furthermore," the Duke said, warming to his theme, "I'm curious about what your headmasters at your respective academies would think about such behavior. Most educational institutions pride themselves on producing gentlemen of character, not bullies who prey upon the vulnerable. I suspect they would be quite interested to hear detailed accounts of how their students conduct themselves when they believe no authority figures are watching." The threat was clear and comprehensive. The Duke was not merely angry. He was prepared to use every tool at his disposal to ensure that these young men faced consequences for their cruelty. His network of influence could affect their education, their family businesses, their social standing, and their future prospects in ways that would follow them for years to come. Eleanor found herself holding her breath as she watched this confrontation unfold. She had intervened to protect Victoria without considering the broader implications, acting purely on instinct and moral conviction. Now she was witnessing the full weight of aristocratic power being deployed in defense of the vulnerable, and the sight was both magnificent and sobering in its implications. What happened next surprised everyone in the room, including Eleanor herself. Duke Pemberton turned to face her directly, and instead of the stern disapproval she expected for overstepping her bounds, she saw something that looked remarkably like respect and gratitude in his steel-grey eyes. For 18 years, they had existed in the same household with minimal direct interaction, beyond the formal exchanges required for efficient operation of his estate. Now, for the first time, he was truly seeing her as an individual, rather than simply another household fixture. "Eleanor Hartwell," he said, using her full name in a way that acknowledged her personhood, rather than merely her function, "you have served this household with dedication and integrity for many years. Today, you have shown courage that puts these so-called gentlemen to shame. You risked your position and your livelihood to protect my daughter when I failed to be present for her." His words carried no condescension or surprise, only acknowledgement of facts and appreciation for actions taken. Eleanor felt heat rush to her cheeks, uncertain how to respond to such direct praise from her employer. In 18 years of service, their longest conversation had probably lasted less than 5 minutes, and it had concerned missing silver that was later found to have been misplaced by a visiting dignitary's valet. To be addressed as an equal in front of witnesses, especially witnesses of high social standing, was unprecedented and slightly overwhelming. "Your Grace," Eleanor said carefully, "I only did what anyone with a conscience should do when witnessing cruelty directed at a child. Lady Victoria is a remarkable young lady who deserves protection and respect, not mockery and torment." She paused, then added with quiet conviction, No position or paycheck is worth remaining silent while a child suffers. The Duke nodded slowly, as if her words confirmed something he had already suspected about her character. "Indeed," he said, "which raises interesting questions about these young gentlemen who apparently possess consciences that function quite differently than yours." His gaze shifted back to the three visitors, who were looking increasingly uncomfortable as they realized that their attempt to dismiss Eleanor as inconsequential had backfired spectacularly. Victoria had been listening to this exchange with wide-eyed fascination, perhaps beginning to understand that the adult world was more complex than she had realized, and that sometimes ordinary people could become heroes simply by choosing to do what was right rather than what was convenient. She looked at Eleanor with an expression of pure adoration that made the maid's heart swell with protective tenderness. "Papa," Victoria said suddenly, her voice carrying a clarity and strength that surprised everyone present. "Eleanor was very brave. She stood in front of me when they were being mean, and she made them stop. She was like a knight protecting a princess in the stories you read to me." The comparison to a knight protecting a princess seemed to crystallize something in the Duke's mind, and Eleanor could see him making calculations and decisions that would have far-reaching implications for everyone in the room. He had built his fortune by recognizing value where others saw only surface appearances, and he was clearly re-evaluating his understanding of both his household staff and his daughter's capabilities based on what he had witnessed. "You are absolutely correct, Victoria," the Duke said solemnly. "Eleanor showed the kind of courage and honor that we read about in those stories, while these young visitors demonstrated the kind of cowardice and cruelty that belongs to the villains." He turned back to the three young men, his expression hardening once again. "Which brings us to the matter of consequences for your behavior." The sandy-haired ringleader made one final attempt to deflect responsibility, his voice taking on a wheedling tone that revealed his desperation. "Your Grace, surely we can resolve this matter among gentlemen without involving our families or institutions. Perhaps some form of private apology would suffice to put this unfortunate incident behind us." His suggestion carried the implicit assumption that the Duke's primary concern was social appearances rather than actual justice. Duke Pemberton's laugh was sharp and entirely without humor. "Private apology?" he repeated. "You believe that words whispered behind closed doors can undo the damage you have done to my daughter's sense of self-worth? You think that convenient phrases can erase the cruelty you showed to a vulnerable child?" He shook his head slowly. "I am afraid you fundamentally misunderstand both the nature of your offense and the requirements of justice." Eleanor watched as the Duke walked to his desk and began writing with swift, decisive strokes. She could see that he was composing multiple letters simultaneously, his business-trained mind organizing a comprehensive response that would address every aspect of the situation. The scratching of his pen against paper was the only sound in the room as the three young men waited to learn their fate, and Victoria continued to watch the proceedings with fascinated attention. "I am writing to each of your fathers," the Duke announced without looking up from his correspondence. "They will receive detailed accounts of your behavior today, along with my assessment of your character and my recommendations regarding your fitness for continued social interaction with respectable families." He paused in his writing to look at each young man individually. "I am also writing to your headmasters, with copies to be forwarded to the boards of trustees of your respective institutions." The implications of such comprehensive action were staggering. In an era when reputation and social connections determined life opportunities, the Duke's network of influence could effectively end these young men's prospects for advancement in business, politics, or society. Their cruelty toward Victoria was about to cost them far more than they had ever imagined possible. As the Duke continued his correspondence, Eleanor found herself studying Victoria with new appreciation for the child's resilience and intelligence. Despite years of subtle and not-so-subtle messages that she was somehow defective or embarrassing, Victoria had maintained her capacity for joy, creativity, and love. The drawings she created were indeed remarkable, showing an artistic sensitivity that many adults never developed, and her emotional intelligence was clearly far more sophisticated than most people realized. The Duke finished his letters and sealed them with his personal signet ring, marking them with the weight of his authority and ensuring that they would receive immediate attention from their recipients. "These letters will be delivered within the hour," he announced, his tone carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "By this evening, Your families and educators will be fully informed of your conduct and character." The three young men finally seemed to grasp the full scope of their predicament. Their faces had gone pale, and Eleanor could see panic beginning to set in as they calculated the potential costs of their morning's entertainment. The sandy-haired ringleader made one last desperate plea, his aristocratic composure finally cracking under the weight of consequences he had never considered. "Your Grace, please," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Perhaps there is some way to demonstrate our sincere regret without involving our families. We could perform service to make amends or contribute to charitable causes, or—" He trailed off as he realized that the Duke's expression remained completely unmoved by his suggestions. "Service and charity are admirable concepts," the Duke replied coolly, "but they are meaningful only when they spring from genuine remorse and a desire to better oneself, not when they are offered as convenient alternatives to facing the full consequences of one's actions." He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the grounds of his estate with the air of a man making final decisions. "Besides," he continued, turning back to face the room, "true service requires humility and respect for those you seek to help. Young men who view disabled children as acceptable targets for their amusement and household staff as obstacles to their entertainment have not yet developed the character necessary for meaningful service to others." His words carried the weight of moral authority that brooked no argument or negotiation. Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude toward this man who had just demonstrated that wealth and power could be used to protect the vulnerable rather than simply to accumulate more wealth and power. She had watched him for 18 years without truly understanding the principles that guided his decisions, but today she was seeing a side of him that commanded respect as well as obedience. Victoria had been unusually quiet during this extended confrontation, but Eleanor could see that the child was processing everything she had witnessed with the careful attention of someone trying to understand how the adult world really worked. When she finally spoke, her words carried a maturity that surprised even Eleanor, who had long suspected that Victoria understood far more than most people realized. "Papa," Victoria said thoughtfully, "why do people want to hurt others who are different? I never want to hurt anyone, even when they are mean to me. It makes me sad inside when people are cruel." Her question was delivered with the directness of childhood, but reflected a sophisticated understanding of human nature that many adults never achieved. The Duke knelt beside his daughter's chair again, and Eleanor could see that Victoria's question had touched something deep within him. "Some people hurt others because they are afraid," he explained gently. "They see differences as threats rather than gifts, and they try to make themselves feel bigger by making others feel smaller. But truly strong people, like Eleanor here, use their strength to protect and lift up others rather than to tear them down." The comparison between Eleanor and the three young men was clear and deliberate, establishing a hierarchy of character that had nothing to do with social position or inherited wealth. Eleanor felt her chest tighten with emotion as she realized that the Duke was using her as an example of virtue for his daughter, elevating her from servant to role model in a single conversation. "Eleanor showed us today what real courage looks like," the Duke continued, his voice carrying conviction that seemed to surprise even him. "She could have remained silent and safe, but she chose to risk everything to protect someone who could not protect herself. That is the kind of person I hope you will grow up to be, Victoria, brave and kind and willing to stand up for what is right." Victoria nodded solemnly, then turned to look at Eleanor with eyes full of admiration and affection. "Eleanor is my hero," she announced with the simple certainty of childhood. "She was brave for me when I was scared, and she made the mean boys stop being cruel." The words were spoken with such pure gratitude that Eleanor felt tears threatening once again. The Duke stood and faced the three young men one final time, his expression showing that his patience was completely exhausted. "You have witnessed today what character looks like in action," he said firmly. "A woman with no social position and no power chose to risk everything to protect a child, while young men with every advantage chose to use their privileges for cruelty. I suggest you spend considerable time reflecting on what that says about your respective characters and futures. The moments that followed would be remembered by everyone present as a masterclass in the exercise of righteous authority." Duke Pemberton walked to the bell pull and summoned his head butler, a distinguished man named Henderson, who had served the household for nearly as long as Eleanor herself. When Henderson appeared with his usual dignified efficiency, the Duke's instructions were clear and uncompromising. "Henderson," the Duke said formally, These three young gentlemen are leaving our estate immediately and will not be welcomed back under any circumstances. Please ensure that their horses are brought around and that they are escorted off the property without delay. They are no longer welcome in this house or on these grounds." His tone carried the finality of a royal decree, and Henderson's expression showed that he understood perfectly the implications of such a comprehensive banishment. The sandy-haired ringleader made one final attempt at defiance, perhaps hoping to salvage some shred of dignity from the wreckage of his mourning. "You will regret this high-handed treatment," he said, his voice shaking with impotent rage. "Our families will not forget how you have insulted us over the complaints of a servant and the tears of a defective child. There will be consequences for your actions that you cannot foresee." The silence that followed this threat was profound and dangerous. Eleanor could see every adult in the room, recognizing the fundamental stupidity of threatening a man like Duke Pemberton, especially after demonstrating such complete lack of judgment and character. The Duke's expression shifted from controlled anger to something approaching amusement at the sheer audacity of the threat. "Indeed, there will be consequences," the Duke replied with quiet certainty, "but I believe you will find that they fall rather differently than you expect. You see, young man, you have just threatened me in my own home in front of witnesses, after I caught you tormenting my disabled daughter. The story of this morning will spread through society exactly as I choose to tell it, and I doubt very much that your version will find a sympathetic audience among people of genuine quality." Henderson stepped forward with the subtle authority of a senior household retainer who had handled difficult situations before. "If you would come with me, gentlemen," he said with polite firmness that somehow managed to convey both deference to their social position and complete certainty that they would comply with his request. The three young men had no choice but to follow him from the room, their morning of cruel entertainment having cost them more than they could yet comprehend. As their footsteps faded down the corridor, the morning room fell into a profound quiet that felt almost sacred after the tension and conflict of the past hour. Victoria remained in her chair by the window, but her posture had changed completely from the hunched, defensive position Eleanor had first observed to the straight-backed bearing of a young lady who knew herself to be valued and protected. With the immediate crisis resolved, Duke Pemberton turned his full attention to Eleanor for the first time in their 18 years of shared residence. She could see him studying her with the same careful assessment he might give to a potential business partner, taking in details about her character and capabilities that he had never bothered to notice during their previous interactions. The scrutiny was both flattering and slightly uncomfortable, as Eleanor was not accustomed to being seen as anything more than efficient household machinery. "Eleanor," the Duke said thoughtfully, "I find myself in the uncomfortable position of realizing that I have been profoundly blind to the qualities of someone who has lived under my own roof for nearly 2 decades. Your actions today have shown courage, wisdom, and moral clarity that shame men with far greater advantages and education." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "I am curious about something. In all your years of service here, how often have you witnessed Victoria facing such treatment?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Eleanor understood that her answer would carry significant weight in determining how the Duke viewed both his own parenting and the dynamics of his household. She had spent 18 years perfecting the art of diplomatic silence, of seeing everything and revealing nothing, of protecting her employer's comfort by shielding them from unpleasant truths. But Victoria's tear-stained face and the morning's revelations had shattered her ability to maintain such protective discretion. "More often than I care to remember, Your Grace," Eleanor replied honestly, her voice steady despite the personal risk of such candor. "Lady Victoria is a sensitive child who feels deeply and loves completely, which makes her an easy target for those who mistake kindness for weakness. She has learned to hide her pain to avoid troubling others, but that does not mean the pain is not real or frequent." The words felt dangerous even as she spoke them, but the morning's events had convinced her that truth was more important than safety. The Duke's expression grew increasingly grave as Eleanor continued her assessment. "She spends hours alone in her room drawing pictures of the family life she wishes she could have, conversations she imagines having with you, activities she dreams of sharing. She has never complained or demanded attention, but she watches every interaction between you and your guests, hoping to understand how to earn the kind of focused regard that business associates receive so easily." Victoria had been listening to this exchange with the wide-eyed fascination of a child, hearing adults discuss her as if she were a real person rather than a problem to be managed. Eleanor could see recognition dawning in the little girl's eyes as she realized that someone had been observing and understanding her private struggles, that her loneliness and longing had not gone completely unnoticed. The impact of Eleanor's words on Duke Pemberton was immediate and profound. Eleanor could see him mentally reviewing years of interactions with his daughter, reassessing moments that he had interpreted as successful parenting through the lens of new understanding about Victoria's actual needs and experiences. The transformation in his expression from defensive surprise to dawning horror suggested that he was beginning to comprehend the full scope of his well-intentioned but ultimately devastating neglect. "For you are telling me," the Duke said slowly, his voice carrying the controlled tone of a man working very hard to maintain his composure, "that my daughter has been suffering regular emotional abuse while I remained completely oblivious, buried in business affairs that I convinced myself were for her benefit." The question was directed at Eleanor, but she could see that he was really asking himself, forcing his own mind to confront truths that were almost too painful to acknowledge. Eleanor nodded carefully, understanding that she was walking through emotional territory that could explode without warning. "Your Grace, I believe your intentions have always been loving and generous. You have provided Lady Victoria with material comforts, medical care, and educational opportunities that most children could never dream of receiving. But children with special needs require something beyond material provision. They need constant reassurance that they are valued for who they are, not merely tolerated as obligations to be managed." Victoria had been following this conversation with the intense focus of someone hearing her own life discussed by adults who actually seemed to understand her experience. When she spoke, her words carried a directness that surprised even Eleanor with their emotional sophistication and painful honesty. "Papa," Victoria said quietly, "I know you love me, but sometimes I think you wish I was different, so you would not have to worry about me so much. When people are mean to me, I do not tell you because I do not want to make you sadder about having a daughter like me." Her words were delivered without accusation or manipulation, simply as observations about her own experience that she had apparently been thinking about for some time. The Duke's careful composure cracked completely at his daughter's assessment. Eleanor watched as this powerful man, who had faced down senators and intimidated business rivals, struggled with emotions that threatened to overwhelm his legendary self-control. He moved to Victoria's chair and knelt beside her again, taking her hands with a gentleness that seemed to surprise both of them. "Victoria, my precious girl," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears, "you have never been a burden or a disappointment. You are my daughter, and that makes you the most important person in my world. I am horrified to learn that my actions, or lack of actions, have made you feel otherwise." He paused, clearly struggling to find words adequate to the moment. "I have been a fool who thought providing money could substitute for providing presence, and I am deeply sorry for every moment you have felt alone or unloved." What happened next would be remembered by Eleanor as one of the most moving scenes she had ever witnessed in 18 years of observing the intimate dynamics of wealthy families. Duke Pemberton, one of the most powerful men in America, began to weep openly as he held his daughter's hands and confronted the full magnitude of his failures as a father. The sight of such raw vulnerability from someone who had always seemed invincible was both heartbreaking and profoundly hopeful. "I want to learn how to be the father you deserve," the Duke said through his tears, his voice carrying the kind of desperate sincerity that comes only in moments of complete emotional breakdown and reconstruction. "I want to understand your world, your needs, your dreams, your fears. I want to be someone you can trust with your pain and your joy, not just someone who pays for your comfort." His words were not polished or calculated, but they carried more genuine meaning than any of his carefully crafted business presentations. Victoria's response was immediate and heartbreaking in its simplicity. She threw her arms around her father's neck and held him tightly, her small body shaking with sobs of relief and joy that seemed to come from the deepest parts of her soul. "I love you, Papa," she whispered against his shoulder. "I just wanted you to see me, really see me, not just take care of me." The embrace lasted for several minutes, during which Eleanor quietly retreated toward the door to give them privacy for this profound moment of reconciliation. But the Duke noticed her movement and gestured for her to remain. "Eleanor," he said, his voice still thick with emotion but carrying new determination, "I need to understand how blind I have been and I suspect you are the only person in this household who can help me see clearly." He stood, keeping one hand on Victoria's shoulder, and faced Eleanor with an expression of complete humility that would have been unthinkable an hour earlier. "I am a man accustomed to buying solutions to problems," the Duke continued, "but I am beginning to understand that some of the most important things in life cannot be purchased or delegated. They require presence, attention, and emotional investment that I have been too distracted to provide." He paused, then asked with genuine uncertainty, "Would you be willing to help me learn how to truly connect with my daughter, to teach me to see her as you have learned to see her?" Eleanor felt her breath catch at the unprecedented nature of this request. In all her years of domestic service, she had never been asked to serve as advisor on matters of the heart, rather than simply matters of household management. The role the Duke was proposing would require her to step far outside the traditional boundaries of servant and master, to become a bridge between his world and Victoria's, in ways that could fundamentally alter the dynamics of their entire household. The conversation that followed would reshape the entire structure of life at Ravenshollow Manor in ways that no one could have anticipated when the morning began. Duke Pemberton, having acknowledged the depth of his parental failures, approached the problem of reconnecting with his daughter with the same methodical intensity that he brought to complex business negotiations. But Eleanor could see that this was different from his usual calculated strategizing. This came from a place of genuine desperation and love, rather than mere desire for successful outcomes. "I propose to restructure my daily schedule entirely," the Duke announced, his business mind already working through practical implications of his emotional revelations. "Victoria's needs will take precedence over all but the most urgent business matters. I will arrange for my morning correspondence to be handled by my secretary, so that I can be present for Victoria's lessons and activities. Afternoon meetings will be limited to no more than 2 hours, and evenings will be dedicated entirely to family time." Eleanor listened to these ambitious plans with a mixture of admiration and concern. She had watched enough wealthy families to know that dramatic pronouncements made in moments of emotional crisis were often abandoned when the immediate guilt faded and familiar routines reasserted their comfortable dominance. But she could also see something different in the Duke's demeanor, a fundamental shift in his priorities that suggested genuine transformation rather than temporary reform. "Your Grace," Eleanor said carefully, "such changes will require significant adjustments, not only in your schedule, but in your entire approach to balancing competing demands on your time and attention. Lady Victoria will benefit enormously from increased involvement, but she will also need consistency and reliability, rather than sporadic bursts of intense attention followed by periods of neglect." Her words were chosen to support his good intentions, while gently warning against the boom and bust cycle that often characterized the parenting efforts of busy, successful men. Victoria had been watching this planning session with the cautious hope of a child who had learned not to expect too much from adult promises, but desperately wanted to believe that this time might be different. When she spoke, her words carried the wisdom of someone much older, who had learned to protect herself from disappointment, while still remaining open to the possibility of genuine change. "Papa," Victoria said thoughtfully, "I would rather have a little bit of your real attention every day than lots of attention for a few days and then nothing again. Eleanor reads to me sometimes after she finishes her work, and those times are very special because I know she really wants to be with me, not because she has to be." Her observation was astute and pointed, highlighting the difference between obligation and genuine desire for connection. The Duke nodded seriously, recognizing the wisdom in his daughter's assessment and the implicit challenge it contained. "You are absolutely right, Victoria. Consistency and genuine interest are more valuable than grand gestures that cannot be sustained over time." What Duke Pemberton proposed next shocked Eleanor so completely that she wondered if she had misheard or misunderstood his words. The transformation from employer to someone seeking her guidance had been dramatic enough, but what he suggested now went far beyond anything she could have imagined when she first walked into the morning room to dust bookshelves. "Eleanor," the Duke said with the formal solemnity of someone making a significant business proposition, "I would like to offer you a new position in this household. Rather than continuing as general household staff, I would like you to serve as Victoria's companion and my advisor on all matters relating to her care, education, and emotional needs." He paused, letting the unprecedented nature of this offer sink in before continuing. This would involve participating in planning her daily activities, attending her lessons to help me understand her learning style, and providing guidance on how to support her social and emotional development. The implications of such a role were staggering. Eleanor would effectively be elevated from servant to trusted family advisor, with authority and responsibilities that crossed traditional boundaries between staff and employers. She would be expected to speak candidly about sensitive family matters, to offer opinions and guidance on parenting decisions, and to serve as advocate and interpreter for Victoria's needs in ways that could fundamentally alter the power dynamics of the entire household. Furthermore, the Duke continued, this new position would come with compensation and living arrangements appropriate to its importance. You would have quarters in the family wing of the house rather than the servants' area, and your salary would reflect the critical nature of your responsibilities to our family's well-being. His offer was comprehensive and generous, clearly designed to ensure that Eleanor could accept without concerns about financial security or social position within the household hierarchy. Eleanor felt her mind reeling as she tried to process the magnitude of what was being offered and the trust it represented. For 18 years, she had been essentially invisible, valued for her efficiency and discretion, but never consulted on matters of substance or importance. Now suddenly, she was being asked to become central to the most important relationship in the Duke's life, to help heal wounds that had been festering for years through benign neglect and good intentions gone wrong. Victoria was watching Eleanor's face with intense curiosity, clearly understanding that the adults were discussing something that could significantly affect her own life and happiness. When Eleanor looked at the child, she saw hope and trust that was both touching and terrifying in its implications. Victoria had already accepted Eleanor as a protector and advocate. Now her father was asking Eleanor to formalize and expand that role in ways that would make her indispensable to Victoria's emotional development. Eleanor found herself at a crossroads that would define not only her own future, but potentially the trajectory of Victoria's entire childhood and development. The safe choice would be to politely decline this unprecedented offer and return to the familiar boundaries of traditional domestic service, where expectations were clear and risks were minimal. But looking at Victoria's hopeful face and the Duke's desperate sincerity, Eleanor realized that some opportunities came with moral imperatives that transcended personal comfort or conventional wisdom. "Your Grace," Eleanor said slowly, choosing her words with careful consideration for their long-term implications, "I am deeply honored by your offer and your trust. Lady Victoria has become very dear to me over the years, and I would be privileged to play a larger role in supporting her happiness and development." She paused, then continued with quiet conviction. "However, I must be clear about what accepting such a position would require from all of us." The Duke nodded, his business instincts recognizing that Eleanor was about to outline the terms and conditions that would make such an arrangement successful rather than merely well-intentioned. He had learned over the years that the most valuable advisors were those who spoke honestly about potential challenges rather than simply agreeing with whatever their employers wanted to hear. "If I am to serve effectively as Victoria's companion and advocate," Eleanor continued, "I must be able to speak frankly about what I observe, even when those observations are difficult to hear. There will be times when I must point out that your business obligations are interfering with Victoria's needs, or when I must challenge decisions that seem convenient rather than beneficial for her development." Her words carried the weight of someone who understood that effective advocacy sometimes required difficult conversations with powerful people. "Additionally," Eleanor said, warming to her theme, "Victoria herself must be included as a full participant in decisions that affect her life. She is far more perceptive and capable than most people realize, and treating her as a partner in her own development, rather than simply a problem to be managed, will be essential for building her confidence and independence." The suggestion that an 8-year-old with mental differences should be consulted about her own care was revolutionary for the time period, but Eleanor's months of observation had convinced her that Victoria's input was not only valuable, but essential. Victoria's eyes lit up at Eleanor's words, clearly understanding that someone was advocating for her right to participate in decisions about her own life, rather than simply accepting whatever adults decided was best for her. "Eleanor understands me," Victoria said with quiet confidence. She listens to my ideas and does not treat me like I am too different to have opinions about important things. The Duke looked between Eleanor and Victoria, seeing a connection that had developed over years of small interactions and mutual respect that he had been too distracted to notice or appreciate. Over the following weeks, the transformation at Ravenshollow Manor was both subtle and profound. Duke Pemberton had indeed restructured his schedule as promised, but more importantly, he had begun to approach his relationship with Victoria with the same focused attention and strategic thinking that had made him successful in business. However, under Eleanor's guidance, he was learning to apply these skills in service of emotional connection rather than mere efficiency or control. Eleanor had moved into elegant quarters in the family wing, a transition that had caused considerable speculation among the other household staff, but had been accomplished with the same quiet authority that the Duke brought to all his decisions. Her new role required her to be available for family dinners, afternoon activities, and evening conversations, making her presence a natural part of Victoria's daily experience rather than an occasional intervention during crises. The most remarkable change was in Victoria herself. With daily evidence that she was valued and heard, the little girl had begun to emerge from the protective shell she had built around her sensitive nature. Her artwork became bolder and more expressive, her willingness to share her thoughts and feelings increased dramatically, and most importantly, she began to believe that her differences were gifts rather than defects that needed to be hidden or apologized for. Eleanor had suggested that Victoria be allowed to display her artwork throughout the house rather than keeping it hidden in her room, and the Duke had embraced this idea enthusiastically. The corridors of Ravenshollow Manor now featured rotating exhibitions of Victoria's drawings and paintings, with the Duke proudly showing them to business associates and social visitors as examples of his daughter's remarkable talents. The message was clear. Victoria was not something to be ashamed of or hidden away, but a treasured family member whose unique perspective enriched their entire household. One afternoon, as Eleanor and Victoria worked together on a particularly ambitious watercolor painting, the Duke appeared in the doorway of what had become their shared art studio, a room that had previously been used only for formal entertaining. He had been making these informal visits regularly, drawn by the sounds of laughter and creative collaboration that seemed to emanate from wherever Eleanor and Victoria spent their time together. "May I join you?" the Duke asked, a question that would have been unthinkable months earlier, when his interactions with Victoria had been limited to brief, formal exchanges during meals or bedtime stories, read with one eye on business correspondence. Now he was genuinely interested in participating in his daughter's activities, rather than simply supervising them from a distance. Victoria looked up from her painting with paint-stained fingers and a radiant smile. "Of course, Papa. Eleanor has been teaching me about color mixing, and I want to show you how blue and yellow make green, but not just any green. Different greens depending on how much of each color you use." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Eleanor could see the Duke's face soften as he witnessed his daughter's joy in discovery and learning. As the Duke settled into the art studio and began experimenting with watercolors under Victoria's patient instruction, Eleanor observed dynamics that she had never expected to witness. The powerful businessman who commanded respect and fear in boardrooms was completely willing to be taught by his 8-year-old daughter, accepting her corrections and suggestions with the same serious attention he might give to advice from his most trusted financial advisors. "Papa, you are pressing too hard with the brush," Victoria said gently, guiding his hand to show him the light touch required for delicate washes of color. "Watercolors like to flow and blend by themselves if you let them. You have to trust the paint to know what it wants to do." Her artistic instruction carried metaphorical weight that was not lost on Eleanor, who recognized the deeper lesson about learning to trust rather than control every aspect of life. The Duke nodded thoughtfully, clearly understanding that his daughter was teaching him about more than just painting techniques. "I see," he said, experimenting with a lighter touch and watching with fascination as the colors began to flow and merge in ways he could not have predicted or controlled. "So, success in watercolors requires patience and willingness to accept unexpected outcomes rather than trying to force predetermined results." Eleanor smiled as she watched this conversation unfold, recognizing that Victoria was naturally gifted not only as an artist, but as a teacher who could communicate complex concepts through simple, hands-on demonstration. The child's ability to guide and instruct her father without making him feel diminished or criticized was remarkable, suggesting emotional intelligence that far exceeded what most people would expect from someone with her developmental differences. "Eleanor," the Duke said suddenly, looking up from his painting with an expression of discovery, "I am beginning to understand something that I should have realized years ago. Victoria does not need to be fixed or normalized or trained to think like everyone else. She needs to be supported and encouraged to develop the gifts she already possesses." His words carried the weight of genuine epiphany rather than mere intellectual understanding. "She sees the world differently than most people," Eleanor agreed, "but that different perspective allows her to notice beauty and possibilities that others miss entirely. Her artistic talents are just the beginning. She has insights about people and relationships that could benefit everyone around her if we learn to listen and value what she has to offer." Eleanor's assessment was based on months of careful observation, but saying it aloud to the Duke felt like a significant milestone in Victoria's journey toward being fully accepted and appreciated. Victoria had been listening to this adult conversation about her capabilities with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was storing every word for future reference. When she spoke, her words carried quiet dignity and self-awareness that moved both adults deeply. "I know I am different from other children," Victoria said thoughtfully, "but Eleanor has helped me understand that different does not mean wrong or broken. It just means I have my own special way of seeing things and helping people." Her acceptance of herself was hard-won and precious, representing months of careful nurturing and encouragement from Eleanor, and more recently, from her father as well. The true test of the changes at Ravenshollow Manor came several weeks later, when the Duke decided to host his annual autumn reception for business associates and prominent families from throughout the region. In previous years, Victoria had been kept upstairs during such events, deemed too unpredictable or potentially embarrassing to interact with important guests. But this year, with Eleanor's support and advocacy, the Duke made the unprecedented decision to include Victoria as a full participant in the social gathering. Eleanor spent considerable time preparing Victoria for the challenges she might face, helping her practice polite conversation, teaching her how to gracefully handle awkward questions or comments about her differences, and most importantly, building her confidence in her own worth and abilities. They rehearsed potential scenarios, from well-meaning but patronizing interactions to outright rudeness, ensuring that Victoria would be equipped to handle whatever social challenges arose. "Remember," Eleanor told Victoria as they selected an appropriate dress for the reception, "you belong at this gathering just as much as anyone else. You are the Duke's daughter, the lady of this manor, and you have every right to participate in your family's social life. Some people may not understand that immediately, but your father and I will be there to support you every step of the way." Her words were designed to build Victoria's confidence while acknowledging the reality of potential difficulties. The reception itself proved to be a fascinating study in human nature and social dynamics. Many guests were surprised to encounter Victoria as an active participant rather than a hidden embarrassment, and their reactions ranged from genuine delight to barely concealed discomfort. Eleanor positioned herself strategically throughout the evening, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough away to allow Victoria to develop her own social skills and confidence. One of the most memorable moments came when Mrs. Harrison, the wife of a prominent textile manufacturer, approached Victoria with the kind of exaggerated sweetness that adults often used when speaking to children they considered mentally deficient. "And what a pretty dress you are wearing, dear," Mrs. Harrison said in a voice typically reserved for much younger children. "Did your nursemaid help you choose such a lovely color?" Victoria's response was both polite and quietly assertive, delivered with the poise that Eleanor had been helping her develop through months of practice and encouragement. "Thank you for the compliment, Mrs. Harrison," Victoria replied with perfect courtesy. "I chose this dress myself because the blue reminds me of the morning sky in my watercolor paintings. Eleanor has been teaching me about color theory and how different shades can evoke different emotions in artwork. Have you ever noticed how the quality of light changes throughout the day and affects the way we perceive colors?" The sophistication of Victoria's response clearly surprised Mrs. Harrison, who had expected simple acknowledgement rather than intelligent conversation about artistic concepts. Eleanor watched with pride as Victoria engaged several other guests in discussions about her artwork, her observations about nature, and her insights into the social dynamics she witnessed at the gathering. By the end of the evening, Victoria had not only successfully navigated her first major social event, but had actually charmed several influential guests with her unique perspective and genuine warmth. Eleanor observed that people seemed drawn to Victoria's authenticity and lack of pretension, qualities that were increasingly rare in their sophisticated social circle, where most interactions were carefully calculated for advantage or advancement. Duke Pemberton spent the evening moving through the gathering with obvious pride in his daughter's performance, introducing her to business associates and encouraging her to share her thoughts and interests. The transformation in his approach to Victoria's public presence was complete and remarkable, representing a fundamental shift from embarrassment and protectiveness to genuine celebration of her unique gifts and personality. "Eleanor," the Duke said, as the last guests departed and they were helping Victoria prepare for bed, "I owe you an apology that goes far deeper than I initially understood. I was not merely neglecting Victoria's emotional needs. I was actively denying her the opportunity to develop her full potential as a person and as a member of our family." His words carried the weight of genuine remorse and newfound understanding. "Tonight proved that Victoria is not only capable of participating in our social world, but that she actually enriches it with her presence," the Duke continued. Several guests commented on her intelligence, her artistic insights, and her refreshing honesty. "She added something to our gathering that would have been missing without her participation." His assessment was accurate. Victoria's natural warmth and unique perspective had indeed made the reception more memorable and meaningful for many attendees. Eleanor felt profound satisfaction as she watched Victoria's confidence continue to grow through positive social experiences and genuine acceptance from the adults in her life. The child who had once cowered in corners while cruel teenagers mocked her differences was now engaging confidently with sophisticated adults who valued her contributions to conversations and appreciated her artistic talents. "You know what I realized tonight?" Victoria said as Eleanor helped her out of her reception dress. "People are not mean to me when Papa and you are nearby because you show them that I am important and valued. When adults see that you respect me, they respect me too." Her observation was astute and revealed sophisticated understanding of social dynamics that many adults never developed. Eleanor nodded, recognizing the truth in Victoria's assessment and the importance of adult advocacy in shaping how society treated children with differences. "That is exactly right, Victoria. When people see that those they respect treat you with dignity and appreciation, they learn to do the same. You are teaching them how to see beyond surface differences to the person underneath." The lesson had implications far beyond their specific situation, touching on fundamental questions about how society could learn to value all its members. In the months that followed the successful reception, life at Ravenshollow Manor settled into new rhythms that reflected the profound changes in family dynamics and priorities. Duke Pemberton had not only maintained his commitment to spending quality time with Victoria, but had begun to discover genuine pleasure in activities that had once seemed like tiresome obligations or interruptions to more important business. The morning art sessions had become a cherished family tradition, with the Duke often joining Victoria and Eleanor for watercolor painting or sketching before beginning his business correspondence. These creative sessions served multiple purposes, providing quality time for father-daughter bonding, while also developing Victoria's artistic talents and giving the Duke a peaceful, contemplative start to each day that seemed to improve his decision-making in business matters as well. Eleanor had instituted what she called Victoria's Choice Evenings, where the little girl could select the family's activity for the entire evening, whether it involved reading stories, playing games, taking walks through the estate gardens, or working on art projects together. These evenings had revealed Victoria's natural gifts as a leader and organizer, as she carefully planned activities that would be enjoyable for all participants, rather than simply focusing on her own preferences. The Duke's business associates and social contacts had begun to comment on positive changes in his demeanor and decision-making style, noting that he seemed more relaxed, more thoughtful, and more willing to consider long-term implications rather than simply pursuing immediate profits. Eleanor suspected that learning to think about Victoria's needs and development had made him more attuned to nuance and complexity in all areas of his life. One winter afternoon, As snow fell gently outside the windows of their art studio, Victoria made an announcement that surprised both Eleanor and her father with its maturity and thoughtfulness. "Papa," she said, looking up from the landscape she was painting, "I have been thinking about something important, and I want to discuss it with you and Eleanor." The Duke set down his own brush immediately, giving Victoria his complete attention in the way that had become natural over months of practice and commitment. "Of course, Victoria. What has been on your mind?" His tone conveyed genuine interest and respect for whatever she might want to share, treating her thoughts and concerns as worthy of serious consideration. "I want to start helping other children who are different like me," Victoria said with quiet determination. "I know there must be other boys and girls who feel sad and lonely because people do not understand them or treat them kindly. I think maybe I could help them feel better about themselves and show their families how to see their special gifts." Her proposal was both compassionate and remarkably sophisticated in its understanding of broader social issues. Eleanor felt her heart swell with pride at Victoria's desire to use her own experiences to help others facing similar challenges. The child's instinct to transform her struggles into opportunities for service demonstrated emotional maturity that many adults never achieved, and her insight into the needs of other families dealing with developmental differences showed remarkable empathy and wisdom. The Duke's response to Victoria's proposal revealed how completely his understanding of his daughter's capabilities had transformed over the past months. Rather than dismissing her idea as childish fantasy or impractical idealism, he began asking serious questions about how such a service project might be organized and implemented effectively. "That is a beautiful and important goal, Victoria," the Duke said thoughtfully. "Tell me more about what you envision. How do you think we might identify families who could benefit from your help? What kind of support do you think would be most meaningful?" His questions treated Victoria as a serious social reformer, whose insights deserved careful consideration and practical development. Eleanor watched this conversation unfold with fascination, recognizing that Victoria was articulating a vision for advocacy and support that could potentially help countless families dealing with similar challenges. The child's understanding of both the emotional needs of children with differences and the educational needs of their families was remarkably sophisticated and born from genuine lived experience rather than theoretical knowledge. "I think we could invite families to come here for art sessions and conversations," Victoria explained, her excitement growing as she developed her ideas aloud. "I could show the children that being different can be wonderful, and Eleanor could help the parents understand how to see their children's special gifts. Papa, you could use your important connections to help change how society treats people who are not exactly like everyone else." The scope of Victoria's vision was breathtaking in its ambition and compassion. She was essentially proposing to create a support network for families dealing with developmental differences, using Ravens Hollow Manor as a center for advocacy, education, and empowerment. The idea had the potential to influence social attitudes and policies far beyond their local community if implemented with the resources and connections available to the Duke. "Eleanor," the Duke said, turning to include her as a full partner in evaluating Victoria's proposal, "what is your assessment of the feasibility and potential impact of what Victoria is suggesting? Your experience with Victoria's development and your understanding of similar families' needs would be invaluable in developing such a program." His request for Eleanor's professional opinion reflected the complete transformation in their relationship, from employer-servant to collaborative partners in Victoria's care and advocacy. Eleanor considered the question carefully, understanding that her response could influence whether Victoria's compassionate vision became reality or remained simply a beautiful but unrealized dream. "I think Victoria has identified a genuine need that is currently unmet in our society," Eleanor said thoughtfully. "Families dealing with developmental differences often feel isolated and unsupported, unsure of how to help their children develop confidence and find acceptance. Victoria's combination of personal experience and natural empathy could indeed provide comfort and guidance that would be difficult to find elsewhere." Furthermore, Eleanor continued, warming to the possibilities inherent in Victoria's proposal, the Duke's social position and resources could give such a program credibility and reach that would allow it to influence attitudes and policies at the highest levels of society. This could become a model for how communities can better support all their members, rather than merely tolerating those who are different. Over the following months, what began as Victoria's compassionate impulse evolved into a comprehensive program that would eventually influence social attitudes toward developmental differences throughout the region. Duke Pemberton approached the project with the same strategic thinking and resource allocation that had made his business enterprises successful. But under Eleanor's guidance, he ensured that the program remained focused on human needs rather than institutional efficiency. Ravenshollow Manor began hosting monthly gatherings for families with children who faced various developmental challenges. These sessions combined art therapy, peer support, parent education, and social activities designed to build confidence and community connections. Victoria served as both participant and junior facilitator, sharing her own experiences while learning from others who faced different but related challenges. Eleanor developed curricula for parent workshops that addressed practical strategies for advocacy, emotional support techniques, and methods for identifying and nurturing each child's unique gifts and abilities. Her combination of personal experience with Victoria and years of observing family dynamics made her uniquely qualified to provide guidance that was both emotionally supportive and practically effective. The Duke used his extensive network of business and social connections to advocate for policy changes in educational institutions, medical facilities, and community organizations that would improve support for individuals with developmental differences. His transformation from someone who had hidden his daughter's differences to someone who actively championed acceptance and inclusion inspired other prominent families to reassess their own approaches to similar challenges. One particularly meaningful moment came when the Harrison family, whose matriarch had initially spoken to Victoria with condescending sweetness, requested permission to participate in the program. Their youngest son had been diagnosed with developmental delays, and they had heard about the supportive community being built at Ravenshollow Manor. Mrs. Harrison's conversation with Victoria during their first visit was markedly different from their initial encounter at the reception. "Lady Victoria," Mrs. Harrison said with genuine respect and gratitude, "I owe you an apology for my behavior when we first met. I spoke to you as if you were much younger and less capable than you obviously are. I realize now that my assumptions were based on ignorance and prejudice, rather than actual observation of your remarkable abilities." Her acknowledgement was both humbling and hopeful, suggesting that attitudes could indeed change when people were given opportunities to see beyond their initial assumptions. Victoria's response demonstrated the grace and wisdom that had developed through months of positive reinforcement and genuine acceptance from the adults in her life. "Thank you for saying that, Mrs. Harrison, but you do not need to apologize. Many people make the same mistake at first because they have not had opportunities to really know someone like me. The important thing is that you are here now, ready to learn and help your son discover his own special gifts." The success of the program at Ravenshollow Manor began to attract attention from beyond their immediate social circle, as word spread about the innovative approach to supporting families with developmental differences. Medical professionals, educators, and social reformers began visiting to observe the methods being used and to understand how such dramatic positive outcomes were being achieved consistently across diverse family situations. Dr. Edmund Whitmore, a prominent physician who specialized in treating children with various developmental conditions, requested a formal meeting with the Duke, Eleanor, and Victoria to discuss the program's methodologies and potential for broader implementation. His visit represented a significant milestone, as medical professionals of the era rarely sought input from families and never from the individuals with developmental differences themselves. "Lady Victoria," Dr. Whitmore said during their meeting, addressing her with the same formal respect he would show any adult colleague, "I have been studying reports of your program's success, and I am particularly interested in your perspective on what elements have been most helpful for the children and families who participate. Your insights could potentially influence how medical professionals approach treatment and support for individuals with similar conditions." Victoria's response demonstrated the confidence and analytical thinking that had flourished under months of being treated as a valuable contributor rather than merely a patient to be managed. "Dr. Whitmore," she replied thoughtfully, "I think the most important thing is that we help children understand that being different is not the same as being broken. When people focus on what we cannot do, instead of celebrating what we can do uniquely well, it makes us feel ashamed of who we are. Additionally, Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger as she warmed to her subject, parents need to learn that protecting their children from the world is not as helpful as teaching them how to navigate the world confidently. Eleanor taught me that I could stand up for myself politely but firmly, and Papa learned that hiding me away actually made other people more uncomfortable than including me in normal activities. Dr. Whitmore took careful notes as Victoria spoke, clearly recognizing the value of perspectives that came from lived experience rather than theoretical study. His questions demonstrated genuine respect for her insights and acknowledgement that individuals with developmental differences possessed expertise about their own conditions, that medical professionals needed to understand and incorporate into their treatment approaches. Eleanor observed this interaction with deep satisfaction, recognizing how far Victoria had come from the frightened, isolated child she had been just months earlier. The transformation was not merely about increased confidence or social skills. Victoria had developed into a thoughtful advocate who could articulate complex ideas about inclusion, acceptance, and human dignity in ways that influenced professional practices and social attitudes. The validation of Victoria's insights by respected medical professionals marked a turning point, not only in her personal development, but in the broader recognition of the program's significance. Dr. Whitmore's subsequent articles in medical journals credited Victoria's observations with advancing understanding of how to support individuals with developmental differences more effectively, citing her as a knowledgeable source rather than merely a case study. Duke Pemberton watched his daughter's growing influence with a mixture of pride and amazement that continued to reshape his understanding of human potential and social responsibility. The businessman who had once viewed Victoria as a burden to be managed discreetly had become her most ardent supporter and advocate, using his considerable resources and connections to amplify her voice and extend her impact. Eleanor, the Duke said one evening, as they reviewed correspondence from families across multiple states requesting information about their program, I find myself wondering what would have happened if you had not intervened that morning in the breakfast room. Would I have continued in my blindness indefinitely? Would Victoria have spent her entire childhood believing herself to be a disappointment and embarrassment? Eleanor considered the question seriously, understanding that the Duke was grappling with profound guilt about years of well-intentioned but ultimately harmful neglect. "Your Grace," she replied gently, "I think your love for Victoria would eventually have opened your eyes to her needs and gifts, though it might have taken much longer and caused more pain for both of you. The important thing is not the time that was lost, but the time that has been found and the positive changes that continue to grow from your commitment to truly seeing and valuing her." Victoria, who had been working on correspondence to families requesting guidance, looked up from her careful writing with an observation that demonstrated remarkable emotional maturity. "Papa, I think everything happened exactly when it was supposed to happen. If Eleanor had not been brave that day, and if you had not been willing to listen and change, I would not have learned that I could help other children and families. Sometimes difficult things happen so that we can learn how to help prevent other people from experiencing the same pain." Her perspective on their family's journey from crisis to transformation revealed a philosophical sophistication that continued to surprise and inspire the adults around her. Victoria had not only overcome her own challenges, but had developed wisdom that could benefit countless others facing similar struggles. The Duke nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the truth in his daughter's assessment, and finding peace with the idea that their painful early experiences had ultimately led to greater understanding and more meaningful service to others. "You are wise beyond your years, Victoria. Your ability to transform difficulty into opportunity for helping others is truly remarkable." As the first year of their formal program concluded, the statistics compiled by Eleanor and the Duke revealed impact that exceeded their most optimistic expectations. Over 60 families had participated in various aspects of the program, with documented improvements in child confidence, family relationships, and community integration across nearly every case. More importantly, several participating families had begun implementing similar programs in their own communities, extending the reach and influence far beyond what could be achieved at Ravenshollow Manor alone. The program had also influenced policy changes at several educational institutions, which began adopting more inclusive approaches to students with developmental differences based on the successful methods demonstrated at the Duke's estate. Medical facilities had started incorporating family and patient perspectives into treatment planning, recognizing that those who lived with developmental differences possessed expertise that complemented professional knowledge. Eleanor had begun receiving invitations to speak at medical conferences and educational seminars, sharing her insights about supporting children with special needs and advocating for family-centered approaches to care and education. The transformation from invisible household servant to respected expert in child development represented a remarkable journey that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. Victoria's artwork had been featured in exhibitions designed to showcase the talents and perspectives of individuals with developmental differences, with several pieces purchased by collectors who recognized both their artistic merit and their social significance. More importantly, Victoria had begun teaching art classes for other children with special needs, sharing not only technical skills but also the confidence and self-acceptance that had been so crucial to her own development. One afternoon, as Eleanor and Victoria prepared for their weekly gathering of families, Victoria made an observation that captured the essence of what they had accomplished together. "Eleanor," she said thoughtfully, "do you remember how scared and sad I used to be when people were mean to me? Now, when I meet new children who feel that way, I can help them understand that they are not alone, and that being different can be wonderful if you have people who believe in you." Eleanor felt tears of pride and satisfaction as she recognized how completely Victoria had internalized the lessons of self-worth and advocacy that had been so carefully cultivated over months of patient work. The child who had once cowered from cruel laughter had become a source of strength and inspiration for others facing similar challenges. "Yes, Victoria, I remember," Eleanor replied warmly. "And I also remember how your father learned to see your gifts instead of focusing on your challenges. That transformation in both of you has made it possible to help so many other families discover the same joy and connection that you have built together." The most meaningful validation of their program's success came from an unexpected source several months later, when Eleanor received a letter that would forever change her understanding of the ripple effects created by single acts of courage and compassion. The letter was from a woman named Margaret, who identified herself as the mother of one of the 3 young men who had tormented Victoria in the morning room that fateful day. "Dear Mrs. Hartwell," the letter began, "I am writing to thank you for the courage you showed in confronting my son and his friends when they were treating Lady Victoria so cruelly. The consequences of that morning were severe and exactly what my son deserved, but more importantly, they led to conversations and changes in our family that have transformed how we understand our responsibilities to others who are vulnerable or different." The letter went on to explain that the young man had faced significant social and educational consequences for his behavior, but that these consequences had ultimately led to genuine reflection and character development rather than mere resentment. He had begun volunteering with organizations that supported individuals with developmental differences, initially as a requirement for remaining in school, but eventually from genuine conviction about the importance of such service. "My son asked me to include his own letter of apology to Lady Victoria," Margaret's correspondence continued, "along with a request that she might be willing to meet with him so that he can personally express his remorse and perhaps learn from her insights about how to prevent other children from experiencing the cruelty he once inflicted. He has become an advocate against bullying in his school and community, using his own experience of causing harm as a way to help others understand the lasting damage that such behavior can cause." Eleanor shared the letter with Duke Pemberton and Victoria, and their discussion about how to respond became another opportunity to demonstrate the principles of forgiveness, growth, and redemption that had become central to their family's values. Victoria's response, when she had considered the request carefully, revealed the depth of her emotional development and her commitment to using her experiences to help others learn and grow. "I would like to meet with him," Victoria decided, after thoughtful consideration. "If he has really learned from what happened and wants to help other children, then maybe our conversation could help him become even better at that important work. Eleanor always tells me that people can change if they really want to, and if he has changed, then I want to encourage him to keep helping others." The Duke's pride in his daughter's capacity for forgiveness and her commitment to service was evident as he arranged for the meeting to take place at Ravenshollow Manor, in the same morning room where the original incident had occurred. The symbolic significance of the location was not lost on any of the participants, representing the transformation of a place associated with pain into a space of healing and growth. The meeting between Victoria and her former tormentor proved to be one of the most powerful demonstrations of personal growth, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption that Eleanor had ever witnessed. The young man who entered the morning room bore little resemblance to the arrogant bully who had mocked Victoria months earlier. His demeanor was humble and respectful, his words carefully chosen to acknowledge the harm he had caused, while expressing genuine remorse and commitment to making amends through service to others. "Lady Victoria," he said, his voice shaking with emotion as he addressed her with the formal respect due to her position, "I cannot adequately express how ashamed I am of my behavior toward you that morning. My actions were cruel, inexcusable, and caused you pain that you did nothing to deserve. I have spent months learning about the experiences of individuals with developmental differences, and I now understand how my ignorance and cruelty contributed to the kind of suffering that no child should have to endure." Victoria listened to his apology with the grace and maturity that had become characteristic of her interactions with others, her expression showing neither triumph nor resentment, but rather careful consideration of his words and their sincerity. When she responded, her words carried the wisdom of someone who had transformed her own suffering into understanding and compassion for others. "Thank you for coming to apologize," Victoria said thoughtfully. "I forgive you, because I have learned that forgiveness helps both people heal and grow from difficult experiences. But I want to ask you something important. What will you do with what you have learned to make sure other children do not have to feel the way I felt that morning?" Her question challenged him to move beyond mere apology to active commitment to preventing similar harm in the future, demonstrating her understanding that true forgiveness often required accountability and positive action rather than simply accepting expressions of remorse. The young man's response showed that he had indeed internalized the lessons of his experience and was committed to using his influence to create positive change. "I have been working with my school to develop programs that teach students about treating everyone with respect and dignity, regardless of their differences," he explained earnestly. "I share my own story as an example of how easy it is to cause harm when you do not understand or value people who are not exactly like yourself. I also volunteer with organizations that support children with special needs, helping them develop confidence and social skills that can protect them from the kind of treatment I once inflicted." Eleanor watched this exchange with profound satisfaction, recognizing that the courage she had shown in defending Victoria had created ripples that continued to expand in positive directions months later. The transformation of a cruel young man into an advocate for vulnerable children represented the kind of profound change that was possible when people were held accountable for their actions and given opportunities to learn and grow from their mistakes. The success of the meeting between Victoria and her reformed tormentor inspired the Duke and Eleanor to incorporate similar opportunities for education and redemption into their ongoing program at Ravenshollow Manor. They began inviting individuals who had previously shown prejudice or insensitivity toward people with developmental differences to participate in educational sessions designed to build understanding and empathy through direct interaction and personal stories. These sessions proved remarkably effective at changing attitudes and behaviors, as participants often discovered that their assumptions about developmental differences were based on ignorance and fear rather than actual observation or experience. Victoria's natural gifts as a teacher and advocate made her particularly effective at helping others understand both the challenges and the unique perspectives that came with thinking differently than the majority of society. Dr. Whitmore documented these educational interventions in medical literature, providing evidence that direct interaction with articulate individuals who had developmental differences was more effective at changing professional attitudes and practices than traditional academic instruction alone. His research credited Victoria and Eleanor with advancing understanding of how to create more inclusive communities through education and advocacy. The Duke had begun using his business connections to advocate for policy changes at the state and federal levels, arguing that society had moral and economic obligations to support all its members in developing their full potential rather than simply providing minimal care for those who were different. His transformation from someone who had hidden his daughter's differences to someone who championed inclusion and accessibility had inspired other prominent families to reassess their own approaches to similar challenges. Eleanor found herself in the unprecedented position of being consulted by medical professionals, educators, and policymakers who recognized her expertise in supporting children with special needs and their families. Her insights, developed through years of careful observation and months of intensive work with Victoria, were being incorporated into professional training programs and institutional policies that would influence how thousands of individuals were treated and supported. One evening, as they reviewed correspondence from families across the country requesting guidance and support, Victoria made an observation that captured the broader significance of their work. "Eleanor," she said thoughtfully, "I think we have shown people that children like me are not problems to be solved or burdens to be managed. We are people with gifts to offer and insights to share, and when society makes room for us, everyone benefits from what we bring." Her assessment was accurate and profound, reflecting not only her own growth and development, but her understanding of the broader social changes that their advocacy work was creating. Victoria had become living proof that individuals with developmental differences could contribute meaningfully to their communities when given appropriate support and opportunities to develop their unique talents and perspectives. As the second year of their program began, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had begun with a simple decision to protect a vulnerable child from cruel laughter. That moment of moral clarity had evolved into a comprehensive advocacy program that was influencing attitudes and policies throughout the region and beyond, demonstrating the power of individual courage to create widespread positive change. The Duke had established an endowment to ensure that their program could continue indefinitely, recognizing that the work they had begun needed long-term support to achieve its full potential impact. The endowment would fund not only the ongoing activities at Ravenshollow Manor, but also similar programs in other communities, extending their influence far beyond what they could achieve through direct service alone. Victoria had begun corresponding with children and families throughout the country, sharing encouragement and practical advice with those facing similar challenges, while also learning from their experiences and perspectives. Her letters were carefully preserved by recipients, who recognized them as valuable sources of hope and wisdom from someone who truly understood their struggles and triumphs. Eleanor had been invited to address the National Association of Medical Professionals at their annual conference, where she would present their program's methodologies and outcomes to hundreds of doctors, nurses, and other healthcare providers. The invitation represented unprecedented recognition of the expertise that could be developed through lived experience and careful observation, challenging traditional hierarchies that privileged academic credentials over practical knowledge. The most meaningful measure of their success, however, was not the recognition from professionals or the influence on policies, but the transformation visible in Victoria herself. The frightened, isolated child who had once believed herself to be defective and embarrassing had become a confident advocate whose insights were sought by adults and whose example inspired other children facing similar challenges. "Eleanor," Victoria said one morning as they prepared for another family gathering, "I want to make sure that no child ever has to feel as lonely and ashamed as I used to feel. Our work helps families understand how to see their children's gifts, but I think we also need to help children understand their own worth before other people recognize it." Her observation reflected sophisticated thinking about the psychological foundations of self-advocacy and the importance of internal validation in addition to external support. Eleanor nodded, recognizing the wisdom in Victoria's assessment and the continued evolution of her understanding about how to create meaningful change. "You are absolutely right, Victoria. Children need to know their own value independently of whether others recognize it, because there will always be times when they face ignorance or prejudice. The confidence you have developed allows you to educate others rather than being diminished by their initial reactions." The culmination of their advocacy work came when Duke Pemberton received a formal request from the governor of their state to serve on a commission tasked with developing policies to improve support for individuals with developmental differences throughout all state institutions. The invitation specifically mentioned the innovative work being done at Ravenshollow Manor and requested that both Eleanor and Victoria participate as expert advisors to the Commission. The recognition represented a remarkable validation of their approach and the unprecedented acknowledgement that individuals with developmental differences and their advocates possessed expertise that was essential for creating effective policies and programs. Victoria would become one of the youngest people ever to serve in an advisory capacity to state government, while Eleanor's journey from household servant to recognized expert would inspire others to value insights that came from lived experience rather than only academic study. "Papa," Victoria said when they received the governor's invitation, "this means we can help children and families all across our state, not just the ones who can come to Ravenshollow Manor. That is exactly what I hoped would happen when I first told you I wanted to help other children like me." Her satisfaction was evident, reflecting her understanding of how individual advocacy could evolve into systemic change that benefited entire populations. The Duke's response demonstrated how completely his understanding of success and accomplishment had been transformed by his relationship with Victoria and his collaboration with Eleanor. "Victoria, serving on this commission will be one of the most important things I ever do, but not because of the recognition or influence it brings to me. It will be important because it gives us opportunities to ensure that other families do not have to struggle alone the way we did before Eleanor helped us understand how to truly see and value each other." Eleanor felt profound satisfaction as she contemplated the journey they had traveled together, from that first moment of intervention in the morning room to this recognition of their work's broader significance. The courage required to defend one vulnerable child had evolved into a comprehensive program of advocacy and support that was influencing how an entire state approached its responsibilities to citizens with developmental differences. As they prepared for their first commission meeting, Victoria made a final observation that captured the essence of what they had accomplished together. "Eleanor, when you stood up for me that day, you were not just protecting me from those mean boys. You were showing me that I was worth protecting, and that gave me the courage to believe I was worth celebrating. Now we can help other children discover that same truth about themselves." The story of Eleanor's courage, Victoria's transformation, and Duke Pemberton's awakening did not end with recognition from the governor or service on the state commission. Instead, these achievements marked the beginning of a new chapter in their ongoing work to create a more inclusive and compassionate society that valued all its members, regardless of their differences or challenges. Eleanor had begun training other advocates and educators in the methodologies they had developed at Ravenshollow Manor, ensuring that their approach could be replicated and adapted in communities throughout the region. Her training programs emphasized the importance of seeing individuals with developmental differences as whole people with unique gifts rather than simply collections of deficits to be addressed or managed. Victoria had started writing a book about her experiences and insights, with Eleanor's assistance in organizing and refining her thoughts for publication. The book would provide encouragement and practical guidance to other children with developmental differences, while also educating their families and communities about how to provide effective support and advocacy. Publishers had already expressed significant interest in the project, recognizing its potential impact on both individual families and broader social attitudes. The Duke had established a foundation dedicated to supporting innovative programs that promoted inclusion and advocacy for individuals with developmental differences. The foundation would fund research, education, and direct services while also working to influence policy at local, state, and national levels. His business acumen and extensive network of connections would be used to advance causes that he had once been too embarrassed or distracted to acknowledge. As they gathered one final time in the morning room where their journey had begun, Eleanor reflected on the profound changes that had grown from a single moment of moral courage. The room that had once witnessed cruelty and neglect had become a symbol of transformation, healing, and hope for families throughout their community and beyond. "Eleanor," Victoria said, now a confident 12-year-old whose insights were sought by adults across the country, "I want you to know that when you protected me that morning, you did not just change my life. You changed how I understand what one person can accomplish when they choose courage over comfort. That lesson will guide me for the rest of my life, as I work to help others discover their own strength and worth." Eleanor smiled, understanding that the most important legacy of their work together was not the policies changed or the families helped, but the demonstration that individual acts of courage and compassion could create ripples of positive change that extended far beyond anything that could be predicted or planned. The maid who had risked her job to protect a vulnerable child had helped transform not only that child's life, but the entire understanding of how society could better support and value all its members. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales of courage, transformation, and the power of standing up for those who need protection. Thank you for joining us on this journey of discovering that love, presence, and moral courage are the greatest gifts we can offer each other.